5, 4. Do the last one silent. Well, welcome everyone to our very first podcast. My name is Tucker Maile, and this is one of my best friends in the world, Tom Velasco. And we are going to spend the next few weeks answering questions that are going to come up as Tom teaches through the book of Revelation. So thank you so much for agreeing to teach through the book of Revelation. I think it's an important book to understand in general, but especially in times like we're in.
Thanks, Tucker. Appreciate that. And also, this is kind of a new thing, really, just in terms of our church, because this is the first time that we've been that we decided to do a podcast.
Yes.
So it's kind of a new venture all around.
I've wanted to do something in this way for a long time, but as we decided to teach the book of Revelation, I realized that we'd probably have a lot of opportunity for people to ask questions, maybe be challenged in some of their thoughts. And my hope is that we'll get enough questions to justify an hour or so of us spending time once a week going through them. And by the first looks of it, we've got some great questions that have come from just our introduction to Revelation that you taught last week. So if you have not watched that, every Wednesday we do a live stream where Tom is teaching the book of Revelation. We did that first one last week, which is available online, and then we will do another one this week. And we hope that whether you're watching online or coming in person, any question you have will be much appreciated, because this is a book that should stir a lot of good, faith-filled questions that I hope will just give us all more excitement for what God is doing at the end of the story.
Yeah.
So,
sounds good.
Are you ready?
Yep, let's do it.
Cool. Well, these questions come in, and there's not a ton of order to them, so we're just going to kind of rapid fire you.
Yep.
And I hope that this will bring clarity to those of you who asked and anyone who's watching now. So, question number 1: why was John, the author of Revelation, on the island of Patmos when he wrote Revelation?
Good question. So one thing I want to just kind of start off as like a disclaimer. A lot of the questions that come in are bringing up things that I will address down the road. Things that will come up just in my general teaching through Revelation. This would be one of those things. I don't mind kind of saying things multiple times because I think repetition is the way we learn things. So you might hear this a couple times, but I do believe that John the Apostle is the author of Revelation. And when I mean John the Apostle, I mean John, who was one of Jesus's 12 disciples, one of the sons of Zebedee, the brother of James, one of the guys who was called to follow Jesus when Jesus called the fishermen, right? Andrew and Peter, and then James and John, who also wrote the Gospel of John. He also wrote the 3 epistles of John, the 3 letters of John. Some people disagree with that. There's some arguments for some potential other people named John. I'm just going to discount that for right now. I mean, I could answer that in a future episode, but for now, I'm just going to leave it that I believe John the Apostle wrote it. And he reveals in the text of Revelation that he is on the island of Patmos. And so Patmos was an island off the coast of Turkey, which in the day was known as Asia Minor. It was a province within the Roman Empire. And it was a place where criminals would often be sent in exile. That was a common form of punishment in the Roman Empire. Of course, death was common, but also exile, being sent off to live on an island where you're never allowed to come back and interact in kind of mainstream society. So why was he in exile? We don't know for sure. Let me start off by saying that. The Bible text never tells us why he's there. So it's not like we have 100% certainty, nor do we have anybody who lived in the time of John who wrote something to tell us why. However, we know enough about history, and there's a tradition that was passed on, a very old tradition, so it gets pretty close to the time of John, which tells us that he was exiled there under the Domitian persecution. And so let me just really quickly explain. In the first 3-4 centuries of church history, the Christian church came under a lot of persecution. And most of those persecutions, by the way, were localized, like the kind of stuff you'd see in the book of Acts. It might be a local Jewish community, like a synagogue, might do various kinds of persecutions, like the rabbis in the city, or it might even be the people. You might have riots or things of that nature. It could be more Roman political, like a governor or somebody like that might enact a persecution. But there were a few times in Roman history when the persecution was an imperial persecution. That is, the Roman emperor himself actually carried out a persecution against Christians, outlawing Christianity and sometimes killing Christians, sometimes exiling them or imprisoning them or whatever. And most, or I should say tradition and most scholars tell us that John was in Patmos under the Emperor Domitian's persecution, which was the second imperial persecution in the Roman Empire. The first one was in the mid-60s AD by the Emperor Nero, and that led to the death of Peter and Paul. And then this would be the second one under the Emperor Domitian in the 90s AD, and it led to the exile of John the Apostle. And so that's what we think, is the reasoning behind it all.
In Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, Jesus and the Father are one. When Jesus says, "My Father only," referring to the idea of the second coming of Christ, which we're going to talk about a lot, "My Father only knows the time," does that mean Jesus doesn't know the hour as well?
Okay, good. So this is a reference to Matthew 24:36, which we looked at on Wednesday night. Matthew 24:36 tells us that of that day and hour, that is the coming of the Lord Jesus, when he's going to return, he says, "No man knows, not even the angels of heaven, but the Father only." And so the question is, well, if Jesus and the Father are one, and the Father knows, wouldn't that mean that Jesus would know? So then the question is does Jesus know? Or did he back then know when he was going to return? That's a difficult question to answer, and I want to tell you why. If you read from a New King James, which is what I was teaching from, or an Old King James, then the way I just quoted the text is how it is written. No man knows, nor the angels in heaven, but the Father only. However, if you read from an NIV, a New American Standard, an ESV, a CSB, any of the modern translations, what it will say is, "Of that day and hour, no man knows, nor the angels of heaven, not even the Son," meaning Jesus. So those translations will specifically specify that Jesus doesn't know when he's going to return. Now, I don't want to get too far into why there's a discrepancy in the different translations. I only want to let you know that it's based on different Greek manuscripts. So the New Testament that we have, and the Old Testament as well, but the New Testament is based on ancient copies of the written text of the New Testament. So like Paul's letters, John's gospel. And you have to understand that when somebody got a copy of one of those letters or the gospel or whatever, somebody would copy it out, hand copy it out. They didn't have printing presses. So you couldn't just like mass produce Bibles or something like that. That wasn't a thing that happened. So what that means is an individual would have to hand copy these, and sometimes mistakes were made. And here's the thing, the mistakes were always minor, but when a mistake was made, then any other copy based off of that one would bear that mistake in it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So what this leads to is you have different textual traditions. That is, some versions of the text include not even the Son, and some don't. And the New King James and the Old King James have chosen the ones that don't include that, and the other translations shows ones that do, okay? Now, why do I throw that out there? I throw that out there because it's not super clear for sure whether or not the Son knows or not. If you follow the King James tradition, then maybe he does know. But if you follow the other ones, he's totally excluded, okay? But there's something else in this question that I really want to bring to light. And that is that the person asking the question was clearly had in mind the fact that Jesus and the Father are one, which is what the Lord says in the Gospel of John. So if they're one, Jesus should know when he's going to return. And maybe he does, I don't know, but here's why the idea that he doesn't is perfectly consistent with the oneness of the Father and the Son. And that is because you have to understand the doctrine of the Trinity as the church has been teaching it. You see, the doctrine of the Trinity says that we have one God, just one, not multiple gods, one God, but that one God is, and this is very important, he is three distinct persons. He doesn't appear as three different people. He is three distinct persons. So on the Trinitarian doctrine, we only have one God, but the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. But here's where it gets tricky. The Son is not the Father, and the Holy Spirit is not the Son. Three distinct persons who are one God. Obviously, there are questions that arise with that, but that's, I think, for another day. But it's this idea of kind of the oneness of God, but the difference, which makes it possible that you have the Father knowing when Jesus is going to return, but the Son not knowing. Now, it's really important that I explain how that works. The early church came up with a theological concept called kenosis. That's a Greek word taken from text in Philippians chapter 2. I think it's verse 4 maybe, verse 4 or 5, right around there, where it says that Jesus, who was God, that he emptied himself of his deity, emptied himself. And that Greek word is kenosis. And then it says, and he took on the form of a bondservant. And so right there, we have a really important doctrine in church history. We have the doctrine of what, in fancy terms, we call the hypostatic union. But here's the thing. What it is that Jesus is fully God, completely God, but he's also fully human, really human. He's not God just putting on a human suit and walking around. Like, he had to actually become a human and live amongst us. And so for him to do that, he had to empty himself of divine prerogatives. That might sound weird, but let me explain what that means. We believe as Christians that God is omnipresent. That is, he is in all places at once, at all times. Jesus is God, and thus Jesus is omnipresent. He is in all places at once. But here's the thing. When he became a man and dwelt amongst us, the man Jesus, he emptied himself of that omnipresence. He essentially gave up that divine prerogative of being omnipresent so that he could live with us in a specific place at a specific time, that kind of a thing. And so that's not the only thing he gave up. So, for instance, Jesus lived life as a child and as an infant, which means as an infant, he didn't know how to talk. The God of the universe, who could do all things, couldn't talk because he emptied himself of his divine prerogative of speech so that he could learn it as a human being learns it. Well, so too with this. If the Son does not know the hour when he's going to return, that means that as a part of his kenosis, he emptied himself of that knowledge. So that as a man, when he's there amongst his followers, he could say, I don't even know when I'm going to return. Only the Father knows.
So it can be possible in the perfect unity of the Godhead that the Father and the Son have different access to the timeline of the end or the return of Christ.
Yes.
Great question. Question number 3. And this is to honor your desire for repetition in your teaching, because I know this came up in the intro to the Revelation class. When is Jesus coming back?
Yes, and this is just kind of a repetition thing. I thought about throwing it out. A friend of mine put it in there. He put his name on there. I kind of think he was throwing it in almost a little bit in jest, kind of, because he could tell where we were going in this conversation. But when is Jesus coming back? If you look back, of course, at last week's teaching, the fundamental point I was making is that based on this passage in Matthew 24, verse 36 that we just read, no man knows the day or the hour when Jesus is going to return. And that is so important because we do live in a day and an age and a time, and part of it's just human nature, where we want to know the answer to that question. And the reality is we have to understand that we will never know the answer to that question. It's like something that was very important to the Lord to drive home as a key point. And so when people read passages which say that we need to be watchful and mindful and keep an eye on the signs of the time, to be prepared for his coming, to watch and wait for his coming, a lot of people interpret that to mean, oh, well, we need to look at the newspapers and we need to look at what's going on in the world so that we can see when he's going to come back. That's not what it's saying. This is why we looked at the parable there in Matthew 24. He says, if the master of the house had known when a thief was going to break in to steal something, he would have stayed awake to watch, to make sure the thief doesn't come in to steal. And Jesus is saying, so too with you. You be watchful. But the watching is about taking care of, it's about making sure that you are faithful and obedient. You see, the idea being that if you are not being faithful and obedient, if you're not watching to make sure the thief doesn't come in, you're going to be sleeping. You're going to be not paying attention. And then what's going to happen is you're going to give way, or you're going to give in to sinful decision making. Like, in other words, you put it this way. If you sit there and tell yourself, well, Jesus isn't coming back for a while, so I have lots of time to repent of this sin, or I have lots of time to choose to follow him, I have lots of time to choose to get baptized, or whatever. What he's saying is, no, that's hypocrisy. Whatever you need to do it now. Do it now and be faithful and obedient now, because Jesus could come back in the next minute. He could come back at any time.
I think the answer is soon. The answer is soon for all of us.
Yes.
Whether we see him face to face at the appointed time to meet him in our death, or he could return.
Yep.
But I don't think the answer is this date at this hour, because that's clearly not what Jesus is getting at as he teaches us to understand the times we're living in.
Yeah. I would add, there's not just the objective reality of Jesus' return that is going to happen. There's also it's still objective, but it's more individual fact that someday I'm going to die. And I don't even know when that's going to be. I could die tomorrow. And in that instance, that's the moment when Jesus has come for me, and I better find myself about the Lord's work.
And it's always framed in the timeline of soon.
Yes, always.
Or a vapor, or a blink of an eye.
Exactly.
And that's Christ's return, and that is the end of all of our lives. It will come soon, and probably sooner than anyone thinks.
Yep.
So this actually leads us to a next follow-up appropriate question. How do we distinguish between people who get it wrong in their predictions and false prophets who prophesy falsely about the return of Christ? Is there a distinction to make between people who try to look at the signs of the time and say, I will give a very loose prediction, and that prediction may or may not be right, and someone who says, you better get ready because at this date, at this year, at this time, this is the end of the world?
Yeah. Yes, I do think there is a difference. And actually, that's something I probably should have clarified a little bit more when I was giving my teaching last Wednesday, and I was going through various Bible teachers who gave various predictions as to when Jesus would come back. Some of those Bible teachers I don't respect. Some of them I would think of as false prophets. Some of them I do respect, and I don't think of as false prophets. I mentioned Pastor Chuck Smith, who founded the Calvary Chapel movement, that he gave a prediction, it was a prediction that in 1981 Jesus would come back, or by the end of 1981, I should say. And he gave appropriate qualifications. He said, I don't know, I could be wrong, I'm not certain of the day and the hour, but I have this conviction it's going to happen. My own pastor that I grew up with, I remember in 1996, he said, I'm not making a prediction, but I would be shocked if Jesus didn't come back by the end of 1996. John Wesley and Charles Wesley, who are two Bible teachers that I have a great deal of admiration and respect for, gave predictions on when Jesus would return. So let me kind of put this in kind of a two-part answer. First, I do think, even though I respect many of those guys, it's always wrong to make predictions. Now, I don't think that makes you evil per se, but I do think the scriptures have been super clear. We don't know, don't predict. So I do think it's wrong. They shouldn't. But I don't think that necessarily makes them false prophets. And I think the marker for what makes somebody a false prophet, and Tucker, you and I were talking about this actually just earlier today, is the passage in Matthew 7, verses 15 and 16, where Jesus gives a warning about false prophets who are wolves, who have come in and dressed in sheep's clothes. The idea being that the wolf wants to kill, steal, and destroy. They want to harm the flock of the church. Like, their motivation, their intention is destruction. They are, in essence, tools of the devil. And Jesus, in verse 16, gives his answer to how you know if it's a wolf. He says, you will know them by their fruits. And so what that means is, of course, you look at their fruits and you ask, is the fruit that they're bearing, is it life-giving? Is it Jesus-honoring? Is it humble? Is it compassionate? Is it for the furthering of the kingdom of heaven? Then I don't think that they're false prophets. Is it, on the other hand, and there are many people who've made predictions like this, and I'll just give one example. Is it rather for gain? Is it rather to elevate their own name? Is it rather for them to destroy the flock, so to speak? The example I'm going to give, just because I listened to a podcast on this pretty recently, was David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, famously down in Waco, Texas, in the 90s. They had a cult, really, that had popped up. And David Koresh it originally started off as just a sect of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But David Koresh started to identify himself as like the end time prophet and also as Jesus come in the flesh. And he started to teach his church that the end of time was nigh, basically, that the end was very soon. And he started to tell members of his church that they would have certain places and rankings in his kingdom because he would be king. And then in the midst of all this, just as one example, he started taking unto himself wives from the congregation. And these wives were 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old girls. They were multiple girls. So he ended up getting multiple wives. And then there came a moment over the course of kind of their journey as a group where he actually came out on a church service and he started rebuking all of the married couples in the church for being fleshly and for not being kingdom-minded. And he told all of the men that they were basically sexual idolaters because they lusted after their wives. And he then tells them, he says, God has ordained that I would be the only husband. So all of your wives are now my wives. And so what happened is, in that movement, all of the women became his sexual partners. That's a wolf. That's a false prophet. He has not come to further the kingdom. He's not come to lay his life down for the sheep. He has come to steal from the sheep. He's come to kill from the sheep. So that's, I think, how you make the distinction.
And that distinction, I think, can be applied to a lot of different categories by which the wolf and the good shepherd could use a flock for gain or to lay down their life, whether it's the end of the world, whether it's to create a commune and just live off the land. I mean, what you just described is a good reminder that Matthew 7 should be read and probably studied more often than not, because at the end of the day, people use the name of Jesus, the power of the word, for all sorts of wrong reasons, and the end of the world seems to be a trendy way to get that going.
Totally.
So let that not be the case now. I'm thankful that you're not making any predictions, but if you do, may you do it very loose and light. Okay, the history matches up well with the interpretation of Daniel chapter 8, and I'm assuming that you'll catch us up to speed as to how that came up in Wednesday. Are there alternative views of that passage? Because for some, it could still seem subjective. So please, for those who didn't watch Wednesday, tell us what this is getting at with Daniel 8, and then how does that sometimes maybe land with a very clear interpretation and then more of a subjective version of that interpretation?
Yeah, okay, so Daniel chapter 8 recounts the history of the wars between the Persians and the Greeks, which happened. The first war broke out in 490 BC, the second one in 480 BC, and led to some pretty famous events. There was famously the fighting of the war between the Persians and the 300 Spartans. But ultimately it culminates in the mid-4th century, in the 300s, with Alexander the Great conquering the Greeks and then going into Persia and conquering the Persians, defeating the Persian Empire and establishing this Pan-Hellenic Empire, which is a Greek empire all over the Near Eastern world, okay? In the prophecy of Daniel, there is a horn that is, let me actually back up, sorry. In the prophecy in chapter 8 of Daniel, when it talks about the Persians and the Greeks, it symbolizes the Persians with a ram with two horns, a long horn and a short horn. The long horn is for the Persians, the short horn is for the Medes. The goat represents the Greeks, and it has one notable horn, is what it says. That notable horn is Alexander the Great. And as the notable horn defeats the Persians, it establishes dominion, rules over all the land, and then the notable horn is broken, and then from it comes four horns, and it's going to be in the midst of that we have this ruler who comes to power, and causes the Abomination of Desolation, which actually isn't mentioned in Daniel 8. I referenced it. It's actually mentioned in Daniel 11, which is talking about the exact same thing. And we will cover that in our study. So the question here is are there other people who interpret that passage differently?
Because what you just described seems very in line with the empires and the history of...
Yes. So let me start off, because I want to be really careful here. Yes, there are people who interpret it differently. I'm going to try to be fair with different views. And I really do believe in being fair, because especially when it comes to symbols, it can be very difficult to interpret. However, when it comes to this, there are a couple of things that tie us down to the text. And as I was kind of thinking over this question, I realized, I think, and I could be wrong on this, but I think I kind of messed up when I taught it. I don't know about messed up's the right word. I was running out of time when I was teaching on Wednesday, and I didn't get to read the full text that I wanted to take a look at. And so I'm going to pull up that text, and I just want to point out one reason why it would be very hard to actually say that this text could be read multiple different ways. And so I'll turn to Daniel chapter 8, and I'll locate verse 20. So I didn't quite get to this, but actually before verse 20, verse 16, the angel Gabriel appears to Daniel, and God tells Gabriel at the end of verse 16, says, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So we just had a vision, right? The one that I just described and I interpreted for everybody on Wednesday. And now Gabriel is being told to explain it. Verse 17, so he came there where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid. I fell on my face. And then he says, understand, son of man, the vision refers to the time of the end. And that gets confusing, because people always think when they see the phrase, the time of the end, that it means the literal end of time. That's not necessarily true. The word end in the original language is very vague and ambiguous. It could refer to any number of endings, okay? And so what he's talking about here is the end of Israel's subjection to foreign powers, okay? Now, I'll skip down to verse 20. And here's why I'm not just trying to, I want to take other interpretations into account. I want to be fair to all sides. But you really can't interpret this passage differently from how I have. Because in this one rare instance, the Bible text interprets it for us. So in verse 20, and I would have covered this if I had not been kind of in a hurry.
We're here.
Verse 20, the ram which you saw, having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Verse 21, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And the first king of the kingdom of Greece that conquered that world was Alexander the Great. So he gives us the historical kind of statement as to what this is all about. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So there's the Ptolemaic kingdom, there's the Seleucid kingdom, there's the Macedonian kingdom, and then there's some other kingdoms which it's hard to tell which one is being counted as the 4th one, because there are a few successor kingdoms that pop up, but they're, these 3 were the prominent ones, but most of Daniel is focused on the northern kingdom of Syria under the Seleucids and the southern kingdom of Egypt under the Ptolemies. And so he then goes on to talk about the king that shall arise, having fierce features, his power shall be mighty. And then it says, through his cunning, verse 25, he shall cause deceit to prosper. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall rise against the Prince of Peace. And so all of this, is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, the king who is going to be one of the successors of Alexander in one of these kingdoms, who's going to persecute the people of Israel and is going to set up a statue in the Holy of Holies and is going to set up an altar where he's going to sacrifice a pig, the Abomination of Desolation. Now, this will actually lead to our next question to this is going to require some more explanation. But suffice it to say, that chapter, Daniel 8, is about Persia, Alexander, and then Antiochus. More is said in Daniel 11, and I'll talk about that when we, as we're reading through Revelation. We'll talk about Daniel 11. But why don't you ask the next question, because it relates.
Well, and just because you've already given so many foreshadowing of future episodes, go ahead and hit that subscribe and like button, because this is a brand new channel. So I want to subscribe because I can't wait for you to do a Daniel 11 teaching as well. So, but the question that ties into this, maybe asked by the same person, did the generation that saw the destruction of the temple in AD 70 see the Abomination of Desolation?
Okay, So here's why this is so tricky to ask, or like such a tricky question to answer. Okay. Without going too much into the text for lack of time, but we are going to cover it in Wednesdays, so stay tuned, because on Wednesdays we're going to go through this chapter, not the whole chapter, but the relevant parts bit by bit. It is in Daniel 11, verse 31. That's when he refers to what I just described. Antiochus IV, the king of the Seleucid Empire, offering the sacrifice of a pig on the altar of God, and that's where he uses the phrase, the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation. That happened, oh goodness, I forget the exact year, 168 BC, about 168 years before Christ, maybe 167. I actually need to look it up. I forgot to do that. But that did happen. And that is what Daniel's referring to in Daniel 11 when he talks about the abomination of desolation. That did happen. Here's why this is tricky. Because many years later, 200 years later, almost precisely 200 years later, Jesus in Matthew 24 is going to be standing with his disciples. It's the chapter we've been talking about. Yep. And I mentioned it last week. He says, look at the temple. He says, I tell you, not one stone will be left on another, but they will all be torn down. If you watched the message, then you heard that. In that same chapter, in verse 15, Jesus' teaching says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then know that the time is near. Okay. So here's the thing. The abomination of desolation did happen in 167 BC with Antiochus Epiphanes. That happened. What Daniel was originally prophesying did happen. But then Jesus says, as if it's future tense, in 33 AD, he says, when this thing happens, the abomination of desolation. So here's how, and this is a principle that I didn't talk about that is important for anybody to understand. Prophecies in Scripture just do seem to have potentially secondary fulfillments, okay? That is, it can have an immediate fulfillment, but then God speaks to us in rhythms and repetitions. He's a poet. I've talked about this in my Genesis teachings, that, one of the things that Joseph taught, told Pharaoh, you guys recall Pharaoh's dreams where he had the 7 healthy cows and the 7 thin cows, and then the 7 plump stalks of grain and the 7 withered stalks of grain. When Pharaoh asked Joseph to explain those dreams to him, Joseph says, your dreams are one. That means they have the same meaning. And then Joseph says, the 2 dreams are one, and God has repeated himself because the thing is established and it shall shortly come to pass. And what Joseph's saying is God repeats himself. Like, that's actually a thing he does to kind of confirm, the reality of the truth. And so you do see these kinds of rhythms in history, and you see the apostles doing this when they're interpreting scriptures or prophecies about Jesus, for instance. So one example is in the Gospel of Matthew. After Jesus is born in Bethlehem, his family goes to Egypt to escape the persecution of Herod. You guys are, I'm sure, familiar with that. And he goes there until Herod dies, and then when Herod dies, he comes back into the land. And Matthew, quoting the Old Testament prophets, says that this is a fulfillment of the prophecy, which says, out of Egypt I have called my son. Okay? Out of Egypt I have called my son. That text is, if you read it in context, isn't about Jesus. It's about Israel being called out of slavery in Egypt. That's what it's about. So it has its immediate meaning, but it clearly has a future implication. And so, yeah, I'm totally open to the idea that the original abomination of desolation, which did happen, could have a secondary fulfillment. Now, I have one disclaimer here. I believe that's always true with prophecies we look at. Something I hope you guys keep in mind when we're reading through the text. But what Jesus is saying is a little confusing here. And I want to draw your attention to Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Luke chapter 21 It's a parallel to Matthew 24. It's like telling the same teaching of Jesus. When it comes to that same verse, in Luke 20, it's 20, or Luke 21, it's verse 20. In Matthew 24, it's verse 15. So those are the two parallel verses. They're saying the same thing. In Matthew's version, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. People automatically think of Daniel 11 because that's where the phrase abomination of desolation is specifically used. But in Luke's version, it actually words it differently. Jesus in Luke's version just says, that's when Israel's desolations are coming. Desolations, Luke 21, verse 20. And the interesting thing is that exact word is also found in Daniel 9, verse 26. And Daniel 9, verse 26 is speaking about the coming of the Messiah, the Prince, which is Jesus, and about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So here's my point. When Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about the abomination of desolation, is he talking about a future abomination of desolation that is just like the one that Antiochus Epiphanes did? Maybe. I'm totally open to that. Or is he referencing the destruction of the temple in Daniel 9? That's actually what I lean towards in terms of my interpretation of that. That Matthew 24, which is largely about the destruction of the temple, is referencing the destruction of the temple in Daniel 9. So that's how I read it, but I'm open to both.
If the desolation that Jesus, the desolation of abomination that Jesus is referring to in Matthew 24 is yet to be fulfilled, does that require a new temple in Jerusalem before his second coming?
That's a good question. So let me frame that really quickly. Because as I pointed out in our Wednesday study, there are lots of different views of Revelation. And one such view, which is the dominant view of Calvary Chapel, is that Revelation is primarily about the future, and that many of the passages we're talking about are still yet in the distant future for us. And this is why the question came up to begin with. And that is because, of course, many Christians believe that in the future, there will in fact be a temple that is built. And that when the Antichrist comes, who is, of course, prophesied about in different books of the New Testament, when the Antichrist comes, he will go into that temple and do exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did. And so people look at this verse in Matthew and say, this is referencing the end of time when that's going to happen. So let me just say this. If Jesus there is not talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans, which is kind of what I think he's talking about, but I'm open to being wrong on that. If he's not talking about that, then yes, there will need to be a new temple for the Antichrist to go in and to commit a new abomination of desolation. There's a couple of passages that seem to imply that will happen. So I'm very open to that being a possibility. I just am not certain on that particular subject. But yes, if the Antichrist is in fact going to go into a temple and set up an exact abomination of desolation like Antiochus did, there will need to be a new temple for that to happen.
Wow. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit to the state of our world.
Yes.
And I think so many people are longing for an understanding of the book of Revelation because of the state of our world, thinking wars, rumors of war, the increase of sin being called good and good being called evil. So with that in mind, as for sexuality and gender, the debate that is going around and that ideology that is increasing the confusion of our world, can it possibly get worse? I am worried about the world my children will be growing up in.
Yes. Okay, so there are clearly things about our society today that are unique, I think, in certain ways in the world. You know, we're obviously going through the book of Ecclesiastes. Yes. Right now, the book of Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. And I think that's true in principle. But obviously we have technologies and things like that have never really existed. The internet's never existed. And that does change certain kind of capacities and certain ways that the world functions. But at the end of the day, when Ecclesiastes says nothing is new under the sun, at the end of the day, it's always a result of how human beings are. It's of how human beings behave. Now, what I do want to say is things are regarding sexuality and gender, they have gotten crazy, right? I mean, they genuinely have. They're at a point I never thought we would reach. I mean, obviously in the news the last few weeks, at least on Twitter, which I've said before, I'm on Twitter too often. This new thing for the last 2 weeks has been constant conversations about parents taking children to drag shows. That's a bar I never in my life thought would have been crossed. Like, I never thought that would be a thing that people are doing, but it is. And I mean, I can't help but bring up when Justice Ketanji Brown, the newest justice in the Supreme Court, well, she hasn't taken her seat yet, but she will. When she's being interviewed by the U.S. Senate, a senator in his questioning process asked her to define what a woman is, and she said, "I'm not a biologist." These are very extreme ways of thinking about this in terms of culture. Like, this is not the kind of thing that you see popping up, throughout human history. I mean, it's just a very, we're definitely pushing the limits of what I think most people thought even possible. But can it get worse? I would say the answer to that is yes. I think absolutely it can get worse, and that might be scary. But I just want to point out that we often have a hard time contextualizing our own problems because we don't know enough about the problems that the world has often experienced, right? It's bad, and it has gotten bad in a way that I never thought it would. But I think part of what makes it so crazy and so shocking to us is the speed with which things have changed, right? I mean, a lot of people forget this, but in 2008, Barack Obama, a Democratic candidate, was elected as president of the United States. People forget this, but he ran on a policy of being opposed to gay marriage. He said, we cannot legalize gay marriage. In that same year, 2008, there was a proposition in California, the most progressive state in the union, to legalize gay marriage at the state level. It failed 60 to 40%. So just 2008, that's not that long ago. It's a radically different way of looking at the world. 2012, Barack Obama ran again on a platform of opposing gay marriage. And it isn't until the court case, Obergefell, I think 2015 is when it happened, when the Obergefell v. Hodges case comes up, where the Supreme Court says people have a constitutional right to marry people of the same sex, that all of a sudden there's this like fast-paced change, like a rapid change, to where over the course of a few small years, we've gone from one way of viewing the world in terms of sexuality and gender to a radically different one, right? Where it's like Pride Month has always been a thing, but now it's positively ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Every company celebrates it. Everybody expects kind of like an affirmation of it. And so the first thing I want to say is one of the things that makes it so hard for us to process is this change has happened so fast. It's happened so fast, and what's more is it's been so pervasive in the culture. So it's like you go from holding a position back in 2008 that everybody held to all of a sudden holding a position where people will genuinely think of you as like a Nazi if you hold this view. And then there's this enormous pressure to think differently because you don't want to be a Nazi or something like that. So we feel this very radical change. And yeah, in certain ways it's unique. It's not like these specific things have happened in other cultures per se. But what I do want to drive home is if you study history, you will find that cultures did very, very crazy things that we can't wrap our heads around. And I'll just highlight a couple of things. One of the big ones I want to point to is, I've taught Greek and Roman history over the years. And if you go back to 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century Greek writings, what you'll find is that in Greece, in especially Athens, but it was all over the Greek peninsula, the culture fully accepted, condoned, and promoted pedophilia. And what I mean by that is, there was enormous social pressure for all parents to let their young boys have romantic relationships with older men. And it was so ingrained in the culture that the idea of having an older man who was a mentor to a younger boy was actually just part of the coming of age process. You actually, as a child, just would have relationships with older men. And here's the interesting thing. The Greeks totally opposed to the notion of homosexuality. Homosexuality was looked at as like a very bad thing in their culture. you could only have romantic relationships with prepubescent boys. And once those boys hit puberty, you actually had to end those relationships. So when I study, because when you study Greek culture, you can't avoid it. You can't skip it. It's so much a part of their culture. Any book you read will reference it, right? And so if you read any Greek love poetry, it's almost all written by men, older men to young boys. And so that fact, when I studied Greek history, I was like, how did this come to be? Like I can't wrap my head, because parents haven't changed. Parents are the way they've always been, for the most part. Like, that's what Ecclesiastes is saying, is there's nothing new under the sun. Parents are protective of their children. They wouldn't want that kind of a thing. But how does a culture get so far down a path where parents don't feel the power to resist something like that? And I don't lift that up to say, having said that, I look at our culture and I go, wow, it's amazing how far a culture can go in certain areas. Like, it really is. So I only want to say, don't think that our culture is unique in its wickedness. Wickedness is a part of humanity, and it's pervasive, and it will find its way to rear its head in almost any culture. And you know, this is just, I just brought up two different kinds of sexual sin that appears in a culture. But even if you move aside from that, like, there are other things that if you stop and consider, how could a culture get so debased? I mean, you almost hate to kind of reference it because it's so commonly referred to, but you think of Nazi Germany, how does an entire country come to a point where they're complicit in rounding up people of certain ethnicities, specifically Jews, but also the Romani, that is gypsies, also people of certain religions, Jehovah's Witnesses. How does an entire society become complicit in rounding such people up and agreeing to put them first in ghettos, and then ultimately sending them to concentration camps and then extermination camps? How does a culture get itself there? I say all of it because a culture can devolve very badly. It can, and our culture could devolve very badly too. But I also find hope in that, because what I want you guys to really think about is this. Even if Jesus doesn't come back tonight, and I think that's part of what really makes people want Jesus to come back. They just want an end to the devolution of culture. Even if he doesn't come back right away, and culture is destined to go on for a little while, cultures like that will collapse. They'll collapse, they'll fail, and we'll start over. It's happened all throughout history. Like, eventually, these kinds of things destroy a society. And if something destroys a society, the society is going to wake up, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to be hard, but it's going to find a way to claw back from what it was and create a new society. And so that's kind of the rhythm of culture and history.
And I will say, as pastors of a church, there is something in maybe our fear and maybe the love of our children that wants God to put an end to it now, so that we don't have to live through the devolving culture. But it's a really exciting time to know Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so if you know Jesus, or if you're someone that looks at all these events with a longing for Jesus, just know that what the enemy intends for evil, with all of the confusion of our era and our generation, which is more confused than ever, and yet it seems to be more fertile ground for the gospel more than ever as well. Mm-hmm. So you really, again, it's a time where you can really kind of sit back and get kind of a bunker mentality, which I think we've all been tempted to do in these last couple of years. But as you just talked about hope, this stuff tends to give darkness its hand and show its hand to those who maybe 10 years ago would have been on the fence, indifferent, apathetic towards God. Mm-hmm. Now there is a real longing for truth that I think will be advantageous to the gospel, to say the least. So we have probably only time for a couple more. I found this interesting because going through the book of Revelation does lend itself to times of question and answer, which brings up a good question in the intro to Revelation talk. I think you covered the fact that Revelation is not a cut and dry book. And so the question is, why do you say the book of Revelation is confusing? I thought God is not the author of confusion.
Great question. Great question.
Amazing question.
Yeah. So saying that God is not the author of confusion, that's clearly a reference to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33, which in the New King James and the King James says that God is not the author of confusion. That's actually what it says. The context of the passage is regarding worship services. And Paul is saying, look, when you get together to worship together, it's probably not best to have people to just kind of start standing up randomly and speaking in tongues without any interpretation. And he says, because if that happens, then an uninformed person, that means a non-Christian who's like coming in to check it out, he's going to come in, he's going to go, these people are weird. And then Paul says, God is not the author of confusion. I don't know that confusion is actually the best translation of that word. It's often translated disorder, and I think that's probably a little bit better. He's basically saying, look, when you worship together and when you commune together, be orderly, right? Because God is a God who creates order, which, by the way, very theologically deep concept, right? Genesis 1 tells us in the beginning was chaos. Like when God first created, it's empty and void. What does he do? He establishes order on the chaos. Now, here's what I don't think it means. I don't think it means that everything God would offer us in the Bible to teach us is clear and easy to understand, okay? And in fact, there's a passage of scripture that I'll point to that tells us that. And this is 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. 2 Peter 3:16. Check it out. Peter, talking about Paul's letters, he says, look, in Paul's letters, there are things that are hard to understand. That's what he says. In Paul's letters, there are things that are hard to understand, which untaught and unstable people twist to their own destruction as they do the rest of the scriptures. Okay? So, understand what Peter's saying there. Peter's saying there are things in the Bible that are really hard to understand. And if a person who is untaught, that is, he doesn't know the scriptures, if he's not spirit-filled, that is, he's not been called by God to teach, he can take those difficult teachings and he can twist them. And this comes back to being a wolf, right? Where he's actually doing it to destroy the sheep. And so just need to first off say there are lots of things in the Bible that are hard to understand. And Revelation is clearly one of those. And the most obvious reason for that is that the book of Revelation has so many different interpretations, so many different takes. Like, I think somebody reading it, maybe who grew up in one tradition, might in their mind think, oh, well, that's the obvious, clear reading of the text. But you have to understand that's because you grew up in that tradition teaching that, right? And so it's the only way you've seen it. But you have to understand, I think about like growing up in the Calvary Chapel tradition, just as an example. Calvary Chapel has been teaching essentially the same way on the book of Revelation as it always has since Calvary was founded in the 60s, the late 60s. So that's a long time. And so people growing up in that are going to have a very systematic way of thinking of Revelation that has been taught them the whole time they've been through it. But the view that Calvary Chapel espoused, which just so you know, I often refer to it as the view of Calvary Chapel. It's actually a theological position called dispensational futurism. Dispensational futurism. That view was first devised by a guy named John Nelson Darby in 1905. So what that means, and I'm not saying that makes it wrong. I'm just pointing out that up until 1905, no Christian believed it ever. They believed parts of it, but they didn't believe that system. And so you're talking about something where every Christian who ever lived prior to 1905 failed to see this thing that should have been obvious if God wanted to teach us just purely obviously. But I want to make one more point on this that I think is really important. There is in everything that God does a simplicity, I think, yes, but also a complexity. And I want to highlight this by two things. First, think about a rose. You walk through a rose garden, you see a rose, and it is simple. As you experience it, it's very simple. It's beautiful. And you don't need to know anything other than I'm experiencing a rose. Oh, and don't touch the stem because you're going to probably hurt yourself. But when it comes to a scientific description of what happens to make a rose, when you start to analyze what it's actually composed of, when you think about how it's composed of cells and how those cells themselves are composed of different components, and if you break those all the way down, you get down to atoms, and you really want to talk about something that's very confusing, atomic theory. Even people who understand atomic theory are very confused as to why the world works that way. It's a very confusing kind of thing. That's just one example. So with that, I bring that up because God created something that is simple and beautiful and wonderful, but it's also confusing if you really want to get down to the knowledge of it. I'll give you one more example. Jesus in the flesh as God. No man has known God at any time, the book of John tells us. The only begotten Son, or the only begotten God, Jesus, has declared him to us. What it's saying is human beings can't wrap their head around God. But you know what we can wrap our head around? We can wrap our head around a human being. So what does God do? He walks amongst us. Is there anything more simple than that? He lives as a man, and because he lives as a man, I know how God thinks because I've seen how God as a man thinks and how he would act in the world and how he would treat people and the kinds of things he would do. That's simple and beautiful and life-changing. But you know what? I've already talked about this today. It also involves kenosis and the Trinity and three different individuals being one God. And what does it mean for Jesus to empty himself, kenosis, of his divine prerogative? But all of that is very complex and very confusing. So I don't want to say by any stretch of the imagination that the book of Revelation is something that we're supposed to read and be confused by. I think the book of Revelation has so much simplicity and elegance and beauty. And I think what the book of Revelation is actually trying to teach us, and this will be tough because it's going to take a while for it to come out, but I think it's very simple and very clear. But there are parts to it that are very unclear, lots of it. And that's because, and those parts I think in Revelation are things that, they're not the main point. I guess that's what I would say. And so the main point is simple, elegant, beautiful. But the difficult points are there, just like in anything that God has made.
Well, I think even in your explanation of it, using the word confusing versus the word complex might be less than helpful, because at the end of the day, we're talking about complexity of things, the complexity of the Trinitarian God, the complexity of atomic theory, and the complexity of the final harvest, gathering the world to the final kingdom and putting an end to space-time dimensions as we know them. Yeah. That, of course, is simple in the storyline, but imagine the detail of the complexity for however God does this in line with what he's revealed, and what he hasn't revealed will be far more complex than a simple, telling of the story. So very helpful, at least for my brain, as you explain it. A couple more. And I think we will now go into the category of housekeeping and maybe more...
Let's make sure to do that one.
More simple. Which one?
That one.
Well, I think we covered that one in the...
I really want to answer this one.
Okay. So this is, I would say when we covered it, this would be in the category of the darkness of our world seeming to be on the rise. But this does add a layer of how long can we handle a culture that is unraveling.
Yeah, I see how it connects. I just wanted to make a couple of comments.
Okay, so the question that came in, how does 4,000 more years, artificial intelligence, robot soldiers, forced injections, nuclear and biological warfare encourage us? So even into that question, it's wow, we're living in at least the beginning of a dystopian time. When you think about all of those things and we just read them like, yep, robot soldiers, check, AI, forced injections, nuclear and biological warfare, we're like, yep, welcome to our year. And how long could this go on? And there was a comment of, if it takes 4,000 more years for Christ to take his seat on the final throne, the response here is, how could you be encouraged? How could you say you're okay with that?
Yeah. And so also to put a little bit more context too, at the start of the study on Wednesday, I said, and I do believe this, Jesus could come back tonight. I really believe in the imminent possible return of Christ. And as you said earlier, I do believe the key thing we're supposed to be thinking about Christ is his imminent return. Soon. Soon is the relevant thing, because it's the soonness that on the one hand motivates us to be faithful, but also it does give us hope, right? It does give us hope. Now, so in this question, when it says, how does this encourage us? I hear there, and I could be wrong, just kind of a sense of frustration with that, because in addition to saying that I do believe he could imminently come, I said, but if it was 4,000 more years, I wouldn't be shocked, which is a very, I think, strange thing for somebody who's an evangelical Christian to say, because I said it more at a philosophical level and a truth level, rather than at like what I feel. I mean, like what I feel and what I believe we're supposed to be living as is the imminent, soon return. But this idea of it being 4,000 more years or however long, I wasn't, just first of all to clarify, I did not mean that it will be 4,000.
No predictions.
No predictions at all.
No prophecy.
I only meant that we don't know. That's the big thing. We just don't know. And so consequently, when we have that feeling that it's going to be very soon at this theological level, the reality is we don't know if it's going to be very soon. And I just want to respond to this particular question with just a couple things. Number one, keep in mind that the early church fathers seemingly very clearly believed that the return was soon, was imminent. And had you told them that it would be 2,000 more years, I think they probably would have felt like this. I think they would have felt like that's not encouraging. And I think they're right. It's not, that wouldn't be encouraging. But also, the Holy Spirit anticipated this. 2 Peter 3 verse 4, Peter teaching, he says, guys, just so you know, in the last days, or not last days, in the latter days, as time moves on, as time moves away from the time we're living in, he says scoffers will come, that is people who make fun of the faith, who make fun of the scriptures, who make fun of the teachings of Jesus. And they will say, where is the promise of his return? Meaning, man, a lot of time has passed and he's not coming back. And then he says, for ever since the time of the fathers, things just go on as they always have. So what he's saying here is they're going to be non-believers who are going to come in and say, oh, you've been telling us Jesus has been coming for 2,000 years and he still hasn't come. And their conclusion is he's not going to come. And then Peter says, don't you understand that things are different with the Lord? With the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day. His point simply being this. A lot of people read symbolism in that. I don't see any symbolism. He's not trying to say count one day as 1,000 years or whatever. Right. He's saying with God, time is not the same. Time is always a vapor to God, right? If you think of an infinite line, any period of time, 4,000 years, if you were to take 4,000 line segments, compress them and put them on a line, it would be infinitely small if it's an infinite line. In any time duration is small compared to infinity. So Peter anticipated this. He anticipated it's actually going to be a while. And people will scoff. And people are going to say that he's not coming because it's been so long. That's actually a fulfillment of prophecy. So the first thing is yes, I can see why it would be discouraging. And I can see why somebody would feel discouraged. I didn't want anybody to feel discouraged because I do think we're supposed to live in the imminent hope of the return of Christ. But here's the thing. Just as I said, I believe he could return tomorrow and the world could end tomorrow. Also, even if he does wait another 1,000 years, you and I, as the Psalms tell us, we have 70 years, and if by reason of strength it is longer, it's going to be 80. No matter what, whether we live a short life or a long life, it's a short period of time. Christ is coming for us very soon, regardless of how history plays out. And then this last point, just kind of an aside, and I do not mean to be glib here at all, but just a reminder that my goal here wasn't discouragement, but it's to try to get at what is true. And sometimes what is true can be disheartening at times. But I don't find here something that's disheartening. Yes, we do have all of these horrible things popping up, but that doesn't mean we don't have awesome things also popping up. And it doesn't mean that, and this was answered in previous question, that things are always just going to carry on like this should the Lord tarry. That's all.
Well, thank you for that. And I, for one, am rooting for sooner than 4,000 years.
Me too.
And I think every generation would like the return to be, within our lifetime.
Yep.
And
well, and let me also clarify, I don't believe it's going to be 4,000 years. Like I actually am like that, I'm inclined to think it's going to be much sooner.
Right.
Right.
Well, I hope so. Time for a couple housekeepers.
Okay.
Number one, could Elon Musk be the Antichrist? Just a housekeeping item as people are thinking about whether to buy Twitter stock or not. I don't know.
So let me start out by saying, of course, people, the specific question says Elon Musk, but you'll hear people constantly referencing any number of people, right? Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. Oftentimes presidents get pushed into that category just because of political figures of various kinds. Sometimes people will point to religious figures, the Pope or the Dalai Lama or whatever. You always hear people identified as potential antichrists. Let me say, could he be? Yes, anybody could be in a sense. Like on the one hand, I think it's possible because I know so very little, and I think we all know very little about who the Antichrist will be. Now, we're kind of short on time. I was going to use this as an opportunity to talk about different teachings in the Bible about the Antichrist. I'm not going to do that right now just because that's going to be something we're going to talk about for sure over the course of this period of time. But let me also say, I think it's very unlikely that almost any of these people that we identify are the Antichrist. And there are lots of reasons for this, but one of the main ones is that the way that most people envision the Antichrist based on, and what the Bible seems to be saying about this person called the Antichrist or the man of sin or the beast or whatever, is that such a person is going to have a specific relationship, it seems, with the nation of Israel, with the temple of God. Here's the big thing, is that people have long put forward the idea of the Antichrist as being a person who comes as like a false Christ. Well, what is the Christ? The Christ is the Messiah of the Jews. He's the King of the Jews. And so I think probably the most likely potential to be a Antichrist would be somebody who is mistaken for a Messiah of the Jews, in which case it's probably going to be a Jewish religious leader of some kind. I'm not saying this, I want people to start looking into different Jewish religious leaders. And I definitely am not saying this to like attack Jews or Judaism or any of those kinds of things. I'm only pointing out that at least a big part of this concept is rooted in the idea of a false Messiah that comes and confuses people because he's standing in the place of the real Messiah. And it seems like very specific, having been written by a Jewish prophet, John in his first letter, or Paul in 2 Thessalonians. It seems like a very specific thing by a Jewish Christian who is foreseeing something about what is like potentially going to happen with his people. That's all.
More to come.
Yes.
And I imagine that version of questions about the Antichrist will be forthcoming. Other than that, there's some requests for you to share some information. We'll do our best to share any kind of helpful references or things that you're using to get some of your questions answered. We'll share those on the YouTube channel. So if you don't see what you're looking for, feel free to reach out to us. And just a reminder that we will film live every Wednesday starting at 7 p.m. Mountain Time.
What do you mean?
For our Wednesday Through the Revelation class that you're teaching.
No, that's 6:30 Wednesday nights.
6:30 Wednesday nights. Tune in live, or if you're in the Boise area, you can join us at Calvary Chapel, Boise. We would love to see you. And that's where we're generating all of our questions. So if you come to our live teaching where Tom is taking us through the book of Revelation, you can submit your questions through our Slido website, or if you're watching online, you can do the same. So if you have a question that didn't come up, or if you have questions that arise as you continue to follow through the book of Revelation teaching by Tom Velasco, we would love to have more amazing times like this. So please feel free to let us know where you're at with this study, and we'll be back next week with another version of Q&A. And this week we will film part 2 of Revelation with Tom Velasco. So thank you for tuning in to our very first Q&A podcast.
Thanks, Tuck, and thanks to everyone else. Hope you guys have a great week.
Amen.